Good evening. I'm going to call the Policy Committee meeting to order. Tonight is Tuesday, June 22nd, 2021. It's 6:03 p.m. I'm Roberto Rodriguez. I'm chair of the committee. And present today, member of the committee is board member Aura Russell Better. Actually, we've been getting in the habit of just doing a quick introduction. So let's go around the room, just your name and your title. And then after that, I'll go through the agenda and the rest of the day. So I'll kick it off to Aura for an introduction.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Aura Russell Better, District 4 board member. Should I pass it along to Dr. Giesman?
Hi, I'm Jake Eastman. I guess now I'm the assistant principal at Deering High School.
I'm Aaron Townsend, the assistant superintendent of school management. Emily?
I'm Emily Chung, and I'm the student representative for Deering High School. I'll pass it to Mr. Botana.
Javier Botana, superintendent. Anne, last but not least.
Anne Rothaker, executive assistant to the superintendent, district office manager, and policy committee secretary.
Great, thank you. And policy committee member Jeff Irish, board member Jeff Irish, did let us know that he might not be able to join us today. I think he has a child that's ill at home, so he's staying a little bit busy with that. All right, so having said that, tonight on the agenda, what we'll do is approve the minutes from last meeting. Then we're going to have a discussion on a draft for the law enforcement policy, KLG. And then that will be probably the majority of our time today. Then we'll adjourn shortly after that. And I think we're sending a few people off to their vacation immediately thereafter. So having said that, is there a motion to approve the minutes of the meeting of May 25th?
So moved.
I'll second. Any questions or comments on the minutes, Aura? All right. Same here. So if we're all in favor of approving the minutes of May 25th, 2021, we'll indicate with a hands up. All right. And that's unanimous with student rep Emily Chung voting with the board member and I, with the committee member and myself. All right. So then we're going to get off. I guess I'll hand it off to Aaron to discuss the policy, and then we'll take it from there. Go ahead, Superintendent.
All right. Well, excited to loop back from kind of the conversations we've been building towards in terms of proposed revision. So tonight we're actually looking at specific language in the policies, and kind of as we, I think, might characterize, we had looked at existing policies and proposed changes, and that's led us to identify the need to articulate this kind of overarching policy, the KLG, to kind of spell out our relationship with law enforcement. And so I think it makes sense for us to start there tonight in looking at that draft policy before we look at the kind of redlined language changes in some of the other policies. So let's start with that. I agree with Chair Rodriguez that this is the most substantive kind of conversation for this evening. So we'll start there, I guess, with framing. Process-wise, what I hope that we can do today is look at, based on our ongoing conversations, the feedback we've gotten, look at these and feel like we have substantive drafts. Obviously, we're looking at the July kind of recess, but I'm hoping, and we can talk a little bit about this, that'll provide some space and opportunity for some engagement to share these drafts more broadly a little bit, certainly with the stakeholder group we convened previously, as well as, specifically potentially students, because that's been a target group that we want some feedback on, and some other, our administrators and PEA as other key stakeholder groups. So just a position today, we're not looking to take any formal action on any of these policies, but just through discussion, kind of provide feedback on these drafts so that when we reconvene as a committee in August, we'll be able to, kind of process any feedback we received and be in a position to potentially start to move these forward for adoption. So that's, I think, where we're at process-wise before we dive in. So just to kind of frame that Are there any questions about that before we go any further, starting to look at the policies? Does that make sense to you, Roberto, and Nora, and Emily, in terms of process?
Yep. That makes sense. And again, just to clarify, we're going to do all of the policies all together. We're not going to do KLG separately and then the other language revisions. We'll do the whole thing as a package.
I think that makes sense. I mean, what we're trying to put forward, as we did with the discipline, is like a coherent set of things. And that's why I think it makes sense to start with KLG, right? Where this is kind of what we're saying are the parameters around relationship with law enforcement, and then to be able to look at the other changes in the policies to see if that's then consistent with kind of what we're setting out. So I think, and we'll talk about it, I have a kind of a caution for us as we start to look at all the other policies, that kind of our lens in this draft of the review is in defining our relationship with law enforcement. There's a lot of different directions conversations could go with the other policies. But want us to kind of stay focused with what I understand our charge to be, which is to kind of revise our policies, or specifically around the issues around how it articulates our relationship with law enforcement. So, but we'll get to that with this next piece.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I think to just add a little bit to that, what that could potentially mean is that we do one set of revisions of some of those policies now. And sort of in keeping with this charge around the SROs, but that we sort of flag that there's additional revisions that we could come back and do to those policies. But it's an effort to just try to actually get the law enforcement aspect of these policies dealt with in one shot.
Can I just ask a question about meeting? Aaron, you just mentioned that, will we still be doing like the third Tuesday? Would that be in August when we would meet? And then at that point want to, have something to bring forward for the next board meeting? Is that
I think that's what our
intention?
calendar is. I
Okay.
don't have the date in front of me, but that's, we calendared through November through this like board.
Okay. I think I just
calendar.
didn't peek at that. Okay. Okay. So the goal would be to then at that meeting have a completed proposal to bring to the board.
That part's the one that I'm sort of hesitant on.
Okay.
I know that, with the summer,
Yeah.
we want meaningful engagement from the folks that we said we wanted to have meaningful engagement, particularly the students. I think that will be very difficult for us to be able to do that in August. So that's my perspective on it. I don't know, Aaron, I know you and I did not talk about the timeline on it, but just as I listened to that, know that we did talk about the engagement piece, I'm a little bit concerned about an August date.
Yeah. I mean, I think we want to, it would be ideal, managing, I think we would hold the value of being deliberative with the engagement in terms of this versus just expediency to get them, in the queue for approval as we start the year. That's had been our target, right? And we're not too far off from it. So I think those are the tensions, but I think we'll have these drafts out in front of people kind of moving out of today that start to set some parameters and clarity. I think in particular with KLG, the biggest question has been like, okay, so when can I call the police or not, right? In what situations is that appropriate? And I think this policy starts to try and define that, and it won't be finished per se, but I think it'll be useful for folks nonetheless. So, yeah.
Okay. And I just wanted to flag, not to discuss this, but if I just wanted to say, I think I'm out of town for that day of that meeting. So I would like to be part, if that is the, decision making as a committee day, just to flag that's not good. I'm not going to be able to attend that. So further discuss, but just wanted to flag that.
Okay. Thank you, Laura.
Mm-hmm. It's like Jeff's here.
Yep.
Hello, everyone. Sorry I'm a little bit late.
That's okay. Glad to have you, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff.
I'll preface this by saying I do have a sick child in the background, so if I have to bump off, then I'll extend my apologies beforehand.
Absolutely. Yeah, no problem at all. Good to have you on, though.
Yeah. So we were just, Jeff, just super briefly, we had just getting started, and if you've been able, given everything you got going on, to see the packet, we're going to start with the draft of the KLG policy. And so we were just talking a little bit about kind of where we're at. So today is not necessarily decision making. We're hoping to come out of this with feedback from you all on these drafts, so that we can map out some engagement. Know there's some limitations over the summer of how much we'll be able to do, but that coming out of today's committee meeting, we'll have drafts with your initial feedback on them, so that we can, re-engage and share them with the stakeholders we convened earlier in the year, student groups, our PEA, our teachers and administrators, as well as other key kind of constituencies, to make sure people have seen versions of these drafts before it's back in front of the committee for decision making and approval. So tonight is really a discussion in terms of feedback. So just I'll say, sorry, Jeff, if you wanted to say something there.
No, I was just going to thank you for the update.
Yep. So this draft, just to say, is my attempt at this is trying to merge some of our discussion and dialogues and the input that we got from the stakeholder group engagement, and some of the work that we've done around kind of when and if does it make sense, the quadrant activity and things like that, as well as the sample Drummond policy. So that is, kind of our main context of sample policy, as well as the model policy from the ACLU of Washington State that spoke to this. So there are kind of a little bit of pieces and a little bit of our feedback from last time about pieces pulling out of the visitor policy that felt like they were appropriate here. So just substantively, that's kind of how we've gotten to this draft. So would it be useful for folks to take a few minutes to kind of get eyes back on it? Or are people ready to start discussing? I think we can kind of talk about it in chunks as we move through it here. But do people need another minute to just kind of refresh?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Jeff and Aura had a chance to read it ahead or before tonight's meeting. So if we can kind of gauge where we are in terms of reviewing it.
I did, but I just wanted to make sure I had it up in my bazillion things that are open. So that's all I need to do is just have it kind of handy. So I just need a minute.
I did review both, and I'm prepared to move forward.
Awesome. Thank you all. Appreciate that. I know it's, yeah.
And I think going in sections and blocks, like you said, makes sense. So yeah, go for it. I'm sorry.
So yeah, I was just going to say there's kind of just the three introductory paragraphs, right, is where I would begin, because then it kind of falls to two main sections from there. This, so there's the introduction, which is just a bit of overall framing that, I think is important to land with the right language. And then we have section 2, which has a number of subsections, but that's really kind of guidance about when it is appropriate or when it's not appropriate to engage law enforcement. And then the last section, is in terms of law enforcement presence, at the schools and how we manage that visits by law enforcement agencies, which, so let's start with just the introductory 3 paragraphs in language and see if people had questions or feedback about any of that language.
So if anyone has any comments, just jump right in. I think we're a small enough group that we can avoid the formalities. So like I said, I'll invite anyone to discuss or ask any questions.
I just noted the final sentence of the 3rd paragraph. The superintendent/administration shall also inform law enforcement authorities when they have reason to suspect that a student or staff member may have violated a local, state, or federal law. I think there's an unnecessary hyphen there, but also more importantly, I think that there may be some cases that we'll uncover in the other policies where there is a potential violation of law that we're considering that doesn't require reporting to law enforcement.
Yeah, I think with force, having read it before, I think what we're referring to misdemeanors. That's probably why it wasn't noted. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the 3 introductory paragraphs are pretty standard for what I would expect. I can, in reviewing the ACLU model policy, I can see where some of that language came, and then the DMV, the Thurman Woodson policy as well. So I can see where it came from. I would say that, and this is not, I don't believe it's necessary as an edit, but in the recent substantive policy changes that we've had like a really thoughtful framing paragraph in some of the policies, right, that describe the overall intent of what we're trying to achieve. I think that this short kind of recognizing the cooperative relationship with law enforcement sort of kind of gets to that. So I don't think we need to add much more than that. But I guess what I'm alluding to is there is an opportunity to say something else about what the expectation of that relationship is. I think that cooperative relationship is a pretty standard way of every relationship that we have with any partner across any areas of our operation should be a cooperative relationship. But there might be something unique about the relationship with law enforcement. So I don't know if there's any thought behind adding a more substantive description of the overall thing, being that this is the policy that's going to do that.
Do you have something in mind?
Well, not specifically, and that's why I said that I'm not necessarily saying that this is necessary, but we've done it in the most recent substantive policy changes. So I just want to add that here so that it doesn't get glossed over as like, oh, what a cute introductory paragraph. Carry on. I think the rest of the policy does have some really, it does do a great job at describing and shaping that what I'm discussing right now. So, which is why I don't think the introductory paragraph is, such a big thing. But again, just because it's what we've done in the most recent big policy changes.
I mean, I'll say, and I'm totally open to feedback around it. I mean, I wondered about that, right? And felt like it was, a little bit of kind of a lightweight description. But, I also wondered, given the role that given the responsibility we take for managing towards a safe and equitable learning environment for our students, the importance of having kind of a vision statement about that work felt essential, right, to kind of guide that in a way that felt potentially. I was curious if this feedback would come up different than describing our relationship with law enforcement, right? So I was aware of that a little bit in putting this together and wondering what the response might be.
I'll just add Chair Rodriguez saying that it didn't pop out at me, but then when you're saying that, I do wonder about if that piece could be improved in that sentence. And I was just peeking, but I think I'd have to look some more at, some of the language that came from our our community discussion. I was wondering if we could find some, remember we found those kind of themes of common language and, definitely feeling of safety was one of those themes. So I don't know specifically what, but maybe if we could kind of look through that, I wonder if some language might come up that could feel stronger or, I don't know, more clear in what the goal is in this policy besides the cooperative word. So I don't know if anybody else has thoughts about that. That's just kind of where my thinking went and finding something that the community might have identified as what we want in that relationship. But nothing's popped out because I need to look through that again.
Okay. If I could add just 2 cents. I think when we're dealing with internal policies, I think it's important that we outline those parameters. And I think it was just brought up when we're dealing. I think the cooperative embodies the relationship perfectly, and I don't know that extending it. I think the content of the policy will embody the vision rather than a mission statement that might make people feel better about what they continue to read. So without the benefit of explanations or examples, then I think the first paragraph is suitable.
Yeah, and I think having heard Aaron say that it was part of the thought process to kind of said to look at the first paragraph. That's kind of all I wanted to hear. You know, that compared to the most recent policy changes, that there was some thought about should we have a substantive introductory paragraph. I agree with Mr. Irish that the policy, the body of the policy, does kind of aim at framing that vision overall. And again, we'll go through it, but just wanted to mark that as something notable.
All right. Appreciate that. And so let's move into this next section that's entitled request.
We do. I looked at that third sentence, the authorization to the superintendent and administration. And I think that slash makes sense in the first one. I'm not so sure that it does in the second one. So I would prefer that the second one be the superintendent shall also inform law enforcement authorities when they have reason to suspect that a student, instead of the administration. I don't think that should be a decision that an administrator it's delegated to an administrator.
Right, got it. That makes sense. So the first sentence is really leading like somebody's on the ground and there's an immediate threat. People should be empowered to request assistance in that. Here, the supposition of the last one is it's not an immediate threat. And so, okay. And, I'll look to make it consistent for our final edits of just, because I don't know that we've used, this is super technical. It's not substantive, but superintendent/administration, I don't think is a way we have referred to that relationship in other policies. So we'll figure out what the kind of our
normally used designate, but
right. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so request for law enforcement. I think this is, a major chunk of this in terms of, I'm going to, Dr. Ahmed has joined us now, so I'm going to bring him into the group. So this really sets, I think answers, or attempts to answer and define criteria for building level leaders particularly, but the community at large, of when it is appropriate or when it's not appropriate, right, for schools to engage with law enforcement in terms of kind of that broad general language of like essential safety and welfare. So, so we can take a moment for folks to kind of, again, just take a quick look, but let's open up discussion on that section. It may be helpful to refer to things by section A or B or whatever.
I'll start if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, should we be raising our hands? I know Chair Rodriguez kind of said this was more of a jump and go.
Yeah, just jump right in. Absolutely.
All right. So in the third paragraph of the previous section, it ends with, I know we just had a discussion with, it may have violated. There are certain under B, there's A through K that are clear, that are existing violations of those laws, local laws anyway. And I'm without specificity, I'm just kind of bringing it into the conversation is I have some concern when we use the word shall not notify under these provisions, which are open in themselves, altercations, abuse, or harassment over the internet. I think we've all historically seen situations where those have led to some pretty tragic endings. And not, I guess I'm trying to get to the root of, perhaps there could come a time where we would but the word shall not is a little bit concerning for me from that perspective. And that goes through A through K. I don't want to have a policy that says we shall not, under these provisions, perceived drunkenness or intoxication. I don't want a 15-year-old drinking on campus, smoking marijuana on campus. That's my perspective, and I welcome those who obviously their insight.
I think that, I'm hearing some echo. I think that maybe I do agree with Mr. Irish that it doesn't need to be like shall not, but more like encouraging to, for that to be like the last extent if it were to get to a higher level. But I think that if the example of someone like a 15-year-old or a high schooler drinking underage, it makes sense to maintain it at the school administration level first, just because we know the history of the police department and the students and how that makes certain students feel, and through lower intense situations where a student might be intoxicated but might not be harming anyone, that bringing a law enforcement might exacerbate the situation. So I think that it can stay the way it is, because the policy already says that unless we're endangering other students or staff, then we would bring in law enforcement.
Yeah, I guess my thought when I read the list of A through O of situations, the policy is not suggesting that we allow those that behavior or that conduct. What the policy is saying that we don't resort to calling the police for that conduct. So the fact that we're not calling the police does not necessarily mean that there's going to be intoxicated kids all over campus. It means that we're going to deal with it through the channels and resources that we have within the building, not resort to an outside source such as the police. So the may not contact, I think, to me seems appropriate based on that. That our first line of defense would be to deal with any of these circumstances internally until, as said before, there's a real and imminent physical threat to a student, staff, or the public.
Yeah, may I jump in just again? Emily and Roberto, I don't disagree with anything you just said. And perhaps I was taking the wrong approach, because I've been in high school before. I know what 15, 16-year-old kids do when they're 15 and 16. I guess to the broader point is, and I think I brought it up in our last policy meeting, is using that language, do we put ourselves in a position where we're accountable or liable if something happens? Like we have marijuana, but for personal use. But if what we determine or a superintendent or his designee determines what's personal use, then goes to someone else, and the parent, that student who perhaps consumes, whether it's alcohol or marijuana or any kind of substance, has an adverse reaction, are we placing ourselves in a situation based on this language from a legal perspective?
Superintendent, you have your hand up. I don't know, you put it up, I think, before Jeff started. So I don't know if it was on.
Mine is a clarifying question for Mr. Irish. And, I heard him say that his, you're there. I just can't see you, so I have to speak to you. Jeff, you said that you had a concern about the language of shall not for those instances A through K, but you're okay with that for L, M, N, and O?
No, I apologize. I just didn't, my Word document cut the page off, so I was just looking at that particular page.
Okay. All right.
Just briefly, and then Nora, I see your hand. I mean, I think when we had that discussion earlier, I think, certainly these will be vetted, these drafts will be vetted with Drummond. We haven't done that yet because we're just at the point of having proposed drafts. So there'll be an opportunity for input around that, and we can ask that question specifically. I think our how I remember our discussion last time was, we have language, in policies and various policies in this one, in JICH specifically, if we're talking about like drugs, and so forth, that expressly prohibit, use, consumption, possession, and so forth. So, that's a piece of insulating, we don't, nowhere do we propose that it's allowable in any instance. I think that would be where we potentially would, obviously there would be lots of issues potentially in play there. So, we say in various ways, it's just how we manage when, those expectations are, contradicted by student behavior. So.
Can I just say that on the Drummond-Woodson sample policy, it has that language. Just wanted to say that. Aura, you had your hand up?
Thank you. Sorry, Roberta, could you say what you said again about the language? What was the specific language that was in the Drummond-Woodson?
May have, the superintendent, the staff member may have committed, so that that language is in the Drummond-Woodson.
Okay. So my comment question is maybe in follow up or just after Jeff's question and comment. I just, in looking at the language of under B, a situation that can be safely and appropriately handled by the district's internal student disciplinary procedures. I guess I'm just, that may be clear for staff with that, but I guess to me, I'm kind of trying to figure out what exactly is safely and appropriately. When Jeff was mentioning like what would be a situation that maybe it wouldn't feel good to have that shall not request. Like, so I was just thinking as a social worker, say, what is my role if, say, a client was threatening harm to themselves or someone else, right? So I was just trying to play out in my mind, in that. So when that would be like under A, harassment over the internet. So say there was a situation, that becomes maybe a threat. Is threat covered under something else? Like, I guess to me, I don't really feel completely clear what being safely and appropriately handled means. Maybe that's just my education about what that may mean. And I don't know if that means it needs more detailed language, but I think that was a place for me that felt like, how would one know, that, and maybe it is following the internal student disciplinary procedure, but I could see a situation where there could be a threat, maybe it was through the internet, but I was just trying to think of an example where that language felt a little unclear to me. Does that make sense?
I think that a lot of the policy does kind of give a lot of leeway to administration at the schools and to the superintendent. And I think that's why the section C that talks about unless it poses a direct threat of harm to students, like even with the example that you just said about a student threatening to hurt themselves, then if we thought that it was too much for the administration to handle, then they still would be able to bring in law enforcement through that section.
And I would just say briefly also, our weapons violence school safety policy does articulate the, utilization of the threat assessment to be able to determine how substantive it is, right, which would also guide some of that decision making around whether it is a potential substantive threat that we're concerned about, or is a passing comment from a kid who is upset, right? That's what that tool is intended for and what we've been utilizing.
So, Erin, with the threat assessment, that's within the internal student disciplinary procedure. Okay, thank you. I think that was the part that this wasn't clear what the process.
I guess I wouldn't say that's, I think this is parsing it. It's part of our practice, right, around maintaining safety. I wouldn't say it's, it's in responding, it may lead to discipline, it may not, but it is part of just that suite of how we maintain a safe, school community. So.
Okay. Thank you.
I think I put my hand up just real quick. I just wanted to call out, I think I heard from, because Roberto, I've heard you being saying may, and I've heard Jeff saying shall, and just wanted, I think, I hear you referring, Roberto, to the may in the A, subsection A, and Jeff, my assumption was you were referring to the shall not in B. So I was hearing you and just wanted to make sure. It sounded like we were potentially talking about two different parts of the policy. So just wanted to call that out or clarify if that was the case and potentially call that out just so we're talking about the same things there.
I think I was referring, there was a comment about the may have violated. So I said that part came from the Drummond-Wilson. The shall not is actually the opposite of the Drummond-Wilson because the Drummond-Wilson has this shall contact. I was just referring to the may not because I think that came in conversation. So I was just going, I'm sorry, Jake, you had your hand up. I was just going to say, so this is sort of why I initially said about the introductory paragraph. So it could be said that the purpose for us to be so specific about when we call law enforcement is because we've acknowledged that including law enforcement in these minor offenses could have the effect of triggering the school to prison pipeline, which we're intended in interrupting. So having that explanatory paragraph that's saying the reason for this policy is X, Y, and Z, then sort of kind of it gives us a framing of why we're being so dogmatic with the rest of the policy. And that's what I was alluding to earlier, that having that introductory paragraph frame the purpose of a policy that's so specific could be helpful. Does that make sense? And that's what we've seen happen in the other, again, really substantive changes that we've had in policies recently, and why the introductory paragraph has been so important, and why we spent so much time drafting the language for introductory paragraphs and been so thoughtful around it.
I'm going to jump in with a few maybe obvious points, but I think, at least for me, it helps to just say them out loud. First, Roberto, I think it could make sense to include that kind of language in the preamble, and it can be done in a way that's not anti-law enforcement. When we're getting into the mays and shalls and shall nots, we're getting into that with all the policies, and it's tricky territory. And part of that is because leeway and discretion is a double-edged sword. If you're looking at executing these policies from an equity mindset, sometimes you're thinking, ooh, I really hope there's flexibility and leeway there. And other times you're thinking, oh, when there's flexibility and leeway, that's when bias can creep in. So I don't think there's really a way around that, except in cases where, like, the threat protocol provides kind of a rubric to go through that tricky territory. And then lastly, and also obviously, as we go through the rest of the suite of policies, we'll want to go back to B and D and make sure that B and D and the policies align, and vice versa, because that's really the meat of a lot of the revisions that we're making.
B and D.
B and D being the sections that say places to involve law enforcement and places not to.
So B and D in this policy.
Yeah, KLG. Yeah.
Yeah, got it.
For instance, I think when we were looking at the drug policy, we were making, at least theoretically, a distinction between possession and trafficking. And that's not currently reflected in KLG, but maybe we would go back and align them so that it was.
I think one of the other, just to kind of follow up on that, one of the other points of discussion that we had last time is that if we did already have a policy that specifically dealt with weapons, how much do we want to duplicate it without just referencing it directly? Remember when we sort of kind of even, in this not necessarily in KLG, but some of the other policies, we even said, do we even need it, having had recently made changes? So I don't know if that's even part of what Jake just included.
Yeah, I mean, as part of the legal review of this, because, we haven't, we asked them to review the other ones, but I think, that DA, where it's saying that, delineating those serious offenses, like we know possession of a firearm, we do have a legal obligation to inform law enforcement. And I'm wondering if there are any others in there that by statute we have a legal obligation, sex offenses, things of that nature, to inform law enforcement that might, the language right now is may request assistance. So just anyway, might change some of our language because this is definitely lifted from the state of Washington draft. So there may be Maine statute that provides some guidance.
I had a clarifying question, or, I don't know what sex offenses are. Obviously rape is there, and it's separated out. So I didn't know what that was specifically. So
I'm assuming it means sexual relationship with the age difference too. I mean, is that considered sex offense? And I don't know the legal language, but isn't it like the few years? I'm assuming that would be under that category, but as illegal, right?
We could dig into that.
Yeah. So I think, for that section, I think there's a follow-up question of like, which of these are required? There may be some statutory stuff about defining what kind of offenses related to, whether it is that statutory rape, right? Or I don't know how it would get defined, but some level of sexual assault that is not rape. So anyway, but that can be a point of feedback that I get from Drummond. Okay, other feedback on this section? I mean, again, the goal of this section was to help to try and delineate, answer kind of this overall question for building admin in particular, but also for teachers and students to help understand when it's appropriate to engage law enforcement, when it's not. So, yeah.
So, Aaron, are we going through all the letters now? Is that where we're at? Or are we
yeah, I mean, we kind of have been working our way down. Okay. Initial comments were about the top, but we were kind of taking this chunk of request for what's the title of it.
Because I had a small question, but were you saying something, Roberto?
No, go ahead, Aura.
Okay. So this question is just really a small, but I didn't know if the theft under 750, is that because that's misdemeanor versus more, what is that number? Do you know where that comes from, that specific?
I would presume it is some threshold for a misdemeanor to felony, but I'll confirm.
Because when I first read it before, I think that came up today, I just thought that looked like totally random, but it makes sense to me if it's, that must be legally significant. It sounds really random to me, 750, but I'm sure it's not. Okay. Thank you. That just stuck out that I didn't understand that part, but that was my only question there.
Yeah, and not to jump ahead, but on, as we were saying on D, on those points on 1 through 6, just in a quick kind of comparison to the points of A through O on section B, there just seems to be more description on those. So maybe what we need is just, the section itself makes a lot of sense, just to have more descriptions to like sex offense and some of the other bullet points. But it's, I think it encapsulates a good starting point of when we would be including law enforcement and in a very general scope point of view.
I have kind of a random question. I don't know what section would go under, but I remember at my middle school at Lincoln, when we used to have like dances, there would be law enforcement just like waiting outside. just like that's not because of like they were called. It was more of a preventative measure than like a response. And I was wondering if the district has already taken a stance on that.
Didn't this come up at our last meeting, Javier? I just can't remember where we landed. We just said
we discussed that at a couple of the previous meetings, and you know, I think the position that we've taken is that it would not be appropriate to have the police on call for a middle school. I mean, one thing to have the police on call, but not to have a police presence at a school dance, or, you know, and so I think that's in general the way that we look at it.
Yeah, I think that was where we were looking at the quadrant activity, I think is when this discussion emerged. And it was, you know, has that just evolved into a practice just because that's the way it's been outside of like a specific, you know, kind of, you know, issue, immediate threat related to that specific dance that's occurring, right? You know, but that's just become the practice, right? And so this is trying to interrogate whether that's a practice that makes sense to continue, and thus led to the stance that the superintendent named.
I have, so I have a couple of things that are more formatting or, you know, and maybe more substantive. So to me, under D, sub items C and D do not relate to the totality of the circumstances, which is what I just, that those don't seem to fit there. They seem like they would be separate, you know, so E and F as opposed to C and D under D. So that's one. And then the other one is what we have there as C. Seems like that should either be A or should be the last of whatever we have. So it's just kind of floating in the middle of, you know, the not serious, the serious. In between it is the for all offenses that do not cause or pose a direct threat, you know, this is what you should do, all these alternatives. So it seems to me that should be either the beginning or it should be the end, but not like a bullet in the middle. And then I don't know if I'm just misreading C and D under D, but
I mean, that's how it was in the model policy. I hear your point. That was just where I kind of copied it over from.
Yeah.
But it seems a little repetitive to even stuff we've already previously articulated.
So I would even say that C in an emergency or crisis situations, district and school staff should call 911. It almost seems like unnecessary as a sentence altogether because, like, armed robbery, assaults involving serious bodily harm, you know, these are that's already stated, right? Like those are emergency crisis situations. So it does seem unnecessary. Is there if
that's A? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So I would even recommend that we eliminate the sentence altogether. As far as D, yeah, I see that. I mean, it could be put anywhere in this policy, I suppose, but I can see how living there at the end of that section seems a bit out of place.
I mean, that section is about if a student commits a serious offense, district and school staff may request assistance from the department after considering the totality of the circumstances.
Yeah, so we go from a serious offense to no immediate danger, then we do this. So it just seems, yeah.
But are we saying it's redundant potentially as well? Given, given up above capital C, I mean, this is, the things and, some of the, A and B even, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would completely agree of getting rid of C and D under those.
Okay. Great. Okay. that takes us to the end of that section. So unless there are any other comments on, and welcome, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you for joining us. I know you've been here for a couple of minutes, so glad to have you with us.
I thank you, Aaron. Thank you indeed. Thanks, Ms. Thompson.
So this last section here, visits by law enforcement agencies, again, was the section from our prior visitor policy, KI, that was recommended, both in the Drummond review and what we discussed last time as coming out of the visitor policy. There are actually two things there. Another, kind of change we pulled out, the proposed revision, as we'll see, is taking out the visits by DHHS and the law enforcement agencies and locating the law enforcement agency piece in KLG here and the DHHS visits in our child abuse and neglect policy. So that's tagging that as a pending revision that needs to happen to a different policy. But so I've copied, I think our discussion was we substantively thought these were, we haven't discussed them as a committee, the language per se, but when the superintendent, Dr. Ahmed, Dr. Giesman, and I met to kind of, apply the lenses that we had discussed, had felt like this language was relatively consistent with, that. So, but anyway, given that preamble, open it up to any questions and feedback on this section about visits by law enforcement agencies.
I have a quick question that number one under B, the law enforcement, if they have reason to believe that the health or safety of someone would be endangered, and that's why they have reason to interview. Wouldn't that always be the case whenever we're contacting law enforcement? Because the reasons we have above for contacting law enforcement are very serious.
Well, this is the example of this is we don't contact them, but they show up and say, oh, knock, knock, knock. Hi, I'm here. I'd like to interview, student B, right?
Oh, okay. That makes sense then.
I have just a question. When something has to be stated in writing from the officer, what does that look like? What is that? Is that a document that's signed by his? Yeah. What is that writing document?
There's no standard for that. It's normally it's normally something on letterhead. But the idea is not to interfere with police, but to actually be on the record. The police, they have when they do that, they're making a record that they believe this to be true. It's not our job to question whether they believe it to be true or not. But, subsequently, if somebody, did something that was, that what they did was, there was no real justification for it, then they would be subjected to whatever the appropriate disciplinary actions, or litigation or whatever it might be.
So just to follow up on that, so Javier, when you say letterhead, doesn't mean that would have to go through anyone beyond that one officer? I don't know.
That's correct. We are not in the business of trying to assert whether the police officer is a good guy or a bad guy. Okay. And we're not in the business of obstructing the police from doing what they think is their job, and so our natural tendency would be to cooperate with them, but this is the safeguard to ensure that it isn't just hey, yeah, I just thought, since he was here, I'd come and talk to him.
This is Jeff. If I could just say a couple things. I read through this a couple times earlier today and then reread it tonight a couple times, and I had to remove some of myself and my thoughts. And I actually think the language is pretty spot on, and the intent also. When we're talking about providing written verification, and I'm trying to bifurcate the random visits for apart from those otherwise justifiably legal to talk to a student. When we talk about written statements and I know we talked about the JCCO kind of visiting as part of a program for a youth that might be in the school. Is that going to have to be on a each time basis, or can we say that this person is assigned a JCCO in the community, or is part of a program outside of JCCO that says, as part of their program, this person is allowed to, as part of their programming, allowed to visit the school for non-investigatory matters, or maybe program growth?
I think that would fall under Section A, where, which is typical. There are some, conditions and agreements that, require some consent that, then govern the ongoing visits and that kind of thing, versus kind of the B, which I think, is a more specific, is an episodic thing, not an ongoing relationship necessarily. It's a specific investigatory thing versus dealing with the JCCO and so forth. So that's how I would read it. I don't know if Javier.
That's my read on it as well, that what you're asking is covered under A. So, if it's going to be an ongoing thing, if the parent consents to it, then it's all good.
Thank you both.
Okay. Remember?
I don't have. I think this. I really like actually the way that the section flow. Yeah, I have no. I just like it. I like the way that it reflects a lot of the conversations that we've had. I don't want to just leave it really. Excuse me. It reflects a lot of the conversations that we've had. I think it's on point with what we've heard from not just the committee, but elsewhere when we've talked about, because it's come up several times about how do we deal with when cops show up without us being the starting point of the interaction. And this reflects what I've heard constantly through these conversations, both at the Family Partnership Advisory Committee, certainly in this committee, in conversations with board members. So yeah, I think it's spot on.
So, and again, just name, this is actually our existing policy language. Like I literally copy and pasted it from the visitor policy, at least the A, B, and C. So the paragraphs underneath are don't exist in our policies. Some come from the Drummond one, which I want to move us to if we're done with this, around the administrative like the procedure, right? KLGR. Because I think, anyway, there's a bit of a mismatch there. But
it almost flows as the preamble, by the way. So I'm going to put it out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I left it here, certainly that first of the final three paragraphs, just because it, again, I mean, maybe that should be the preamble to the visits section, just because it, has an assertive statement about that I think the language is then consistent with about, that, and what we've said, like if doesn't have to, school is not the place of business unless it's about a matter of, an emergency or health and safety, or there's the prior consent. These other safeguards have been, kind of followed. But Okay. Well, great. So I have, a variety of kind of questions for us to, some things to kind of take out in terms of, the prior section, that C and D that we talked about, some questions to get, to guide the feedback from Drummond in terms of statutory things, that do require the referral to law enforcement for that under that serious offenses, and then some other kind of additional language considerations. And I think then back to the top, the consideration of kind of the purpose, as I heard you name it, Roberto, that there might be a little bit of language to add there to help frame the purpose of why the policy articulates what it does in terms of the relationship. So, okay. Well, I would love to talk for a minute about KLGR, because I think this, what I'll say here is this is pretty much the Drummond model policy. So this is where we're beginning, because in part, I felt like, in trying to work between the model policies, from Drummond and ACLU in Washington, the ACLU one in Washington doesn't, presuppose a companion procedure, so a lot of the language that's in the policy here potentially nominally could fall into a procedure. Interested in a little guidance of like how much value we see in KLGR if given the language that we have in the actual policy itself. So that's kind of my big opening question. And that's part of why I left it the way it was. I was like, I'm not sure how this squares given what we were looking to incorporate or, utilize from the ACLU model policy.
Can you clarify, like, I don't know if I'm looking at the wrong one. This is super short, just like one page and then.
Yeah, that's it. That was the model procedure from Drummond for KLGR.
My general take on the procedures is that they're best done subsequent to the implementation of the policy, as you begin to understand what are some of the additional details. And that doesn't hold true in all cases. And I know it's not been our uniform practice, but, just given the level of detail in the policy as it currently exists, I would prefer to sort of move forward with that and not try to expand on it, which is what the procedures. These procedures are useless in the context of everything that we've, talked about. So if we're going to do procedures, there's a significant amount of work that needs to be done. And I think, we should live in the house for a little bit before we start adding the detail.
It's a metaphor that has a lot of resonance currently.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? Sorry, I didn't mean to cause
good. I agree with it.
I'd say partly along the same lines, the policies that we're yet to review, some of them will have procedures, and I think that's the level at which the procedure part of a policy is going to be helpful. But for something like this, it's just the framing of the subsequent policies. I agree that seems unnecessary, and it might even be tangling us up in wording that's not, worth our time.
Right. And I think the policy, if I recall correctly, I don't have it in front of me anymore, but it did specify that, that the superintendent that it authorizes the superintendent to develop procedures for the implementation, and that those procedures are subject to approval by the board. So I think, from an accountability perspective, if we don't have them now, but we do get them somewhere down the road, it would again come through this committee.
Yeah, but it doesn't. I appreciate Roberto's point there, right? That a number of the other, the bomb threat one has a procedure associated with it that articulates that. A number of them do, which is where you do get into the details of spelling out for those kinds of specific instances. So there'll be a question of as you were saying, are there additional procedures that are necessary? And it's probably too early to name that. Okay, so we'll kind of retire this model, KLGR for the time being, and work on revising, refining, executing on KLG once we get to that place, as well as the associated set of policies here. Okay. Great. So I just want to do a time check and thought about how we want to manage this last part. So, it's 7:08 and we have, how many of these? A fair number of additional policies. We wanted to save just a couple minutes for an update at the end of our discussions, internally about kind of the reallocation of some of that, just to update you all of where we stand with thinking about the prior SRO resources and how we're considering advancing using those in line with the board resolution. So that's just a short update at the end. But so there are a number of these. There's not, we talked about the substantive nature of these revisions last time. And so what each of these has is red line version of the proposed actual language changes. I guess I'm open to, with our 20 minutes we have left, effectively, potentially 15 for this, 5 to just do that quick update, what we think might be the best approach here.
Because we have to do all of them, I would just start at the beginning and work our way through. I don't know that there's one that is more important than the others. I don't think that we're going to approve any of them until we're ready to approve them all. So,
yeah. So let's try and get a couple done here. So the top level one is EBCC. So we'll just go in order here. So let's do bomb threats and the related administrative guidelines there. And some of these may not have significant changes. So these may be relatively quick because that's a little bit, you weren't. So yeah, again, and so this is where I'll offer the caveat on, as we look at these individual policies, let's just maintain our lens on how it details our relationship with law enforcement, not necessarily opening up Pandora's box about the definition of bombs and so forth right now, for example, in this context.
Can I ask a more of a procedural question, I guess?
Sure.
Is it necessary to review all of these internal policies before should we review these after we have a more solid foundation on what we just discussed? But would the goalpost not change as we revise language and have to redo all of this? Just a discussion. I don't know how many times we plan on meeting again, not just internally, but with the public, and when we anticipate rolling this out. But is this something that should be addressed tonight, or should we create a better foundation wording wise on the foundational principle with law enforcement interaction?
I mean, it is, in my mind, a little bit of a, chicken and egg, sort of a question. I mean, I understand it, and I think it's a good question. I don't know. I am struck by the chicken and egg, sort of aspect of this. In this particular policy, the only reference to law enforcement is under the reporting, right?
Yeah, and I read through most of them, and I think the redlining changes were small, but to the extent we change it, should we revisit once we create that foundation?
So I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm actually, I'm inclined to agree with Ms. Irish, especially after seeing that most of the red line changes are not substantive, right? We're going from school committee to school board, et cetera, et cetera. And to Ms. Irish's point, if we were to just solidify KLG, we might come back and say, oh, this policy is not even necessary. Much like we said, some of our discipline policies might be redundant. So maybe KLG is like the next step of the big overall process that we need to finalize before we come here. Unless you've already identified substantive changes that we really need to get started with right now that you don't foresee are going to be, that you think we should maybe put to the forefront. Aura, do you have any opinion on that, on whether we move forward or we should solidify KLG as the overarching policy?
No, I was just thinking with the not meeting till August, like whatever is using our time here for 15 minutes most efficiently. But I hear the point about, will we have to go back to it again? But
yeah, I mean, I think bomb threat stands out, may not be the most, because there really were no substantive changes there. I think, and I will say the most substantive changes that we discussed last time, that we summarized in that PowerPoint had to do with the visitor policy, in which we were pulling the language out of the visitor policy, which is what we just discussed, that is now part of KLG. So again, we are copying and pasting. So obviously that's a substantive revision to policy KI, but the language itself actually remains pretty consistent. The student records one, I would say is a substantive revision. I mean, it's not a super language smithing one, but the proposed revision was eliminating, the designation of the Portland Police Department as our designated law enforcement, because that just created some safeguards on the information sharing. So it's a substantive change, but it's not a nuanced language thing. It's like it's in or it's out. To the degree. And then I would say, the drug and alcohol policy in questioning and searches of students fall a little bit in between. There were some changes there. They're not super detailed and substantive, but those could be anyway. So I think it could fall into, we could scoop them up later once we land KLG. I think that's, could be fine and appropriate. But I think those are the ones that have a little bit more than the bomb threat one. The bomb threat one was like, seemed pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I would suggest for those policies, and I know everyone's on a clock here, and we're supposed to end at 7:30. For those policies, albeit few, that have somewhat significant changes, either keep or delete, that we address, that we provide the appropriate amount of time to have conversation about whether or not or what the language looks like. So I would be in favor of setting KLG down as a foundation before we address omissions to any other policies the school has.
Great. I feel good about that. So, and even glancing really quick at KI, it looks like what we did was just delete that section and added it to KLG. So I think let's just focus on KLG, and we might even be able to, again, literally just delete sections from other ones or do away with policies. KLG seems to be doing, and initially, if you recall, I wasn't enthusiastic about having KLG, but now it feels like it is a good place for us to capture all.
Yeah, and I would just caution, I don't know that it'll mean we do away with wholesale with policies. There's, a number of required policies that I think most of these are, but the level of language changes, yes, could be easily kind of determined by where we land with KLG. And so it doesn't, the substantive discussion may just live there, and we could look for that kind of consistency that I think Jake named and we've named, flowing from like, okay, KLG. And so, yes, just a process check of the proposed revisions are then consistent with it. Okay. Great. So good. Excited about the feedback and discussion we had around KLG and working to kind of plan some additional kind of stakeholder engagement and feedback. So I'll be working on that once they come back from vacation, in terms of mapping that out and what's possible over the summer here, recognizing there's limitations in that, so that we can be prepared for, follow-up substantive discussion when we convene again.
That sounds good. And you notice the members of this committee are trying to get you on that vacation a little bit early. So for once, I'll say, look at Javier. He's not convinced. Yeah, this sounds like a good. Unless Jeff or Aura have anything else to add, that's like a good plan to move forward with.
Oh, I didn't know whether or not we were addressing Mr. Townsend's comments on the SRO financial issue before we close.
Yeah, we still have to do that. Can I just say real quick, since we do have the extra minutes and Aaron is not in a hurry to start vacation. So on KLG real quick, I think it reflects very much what I'm really interested to hear, how the police department feels about it. My sense is that they will be appreciative of the clarity behind the interactions and how purposeful we're being at being very clear of that, versus all the kind of like gray area that we have potentially been operating in. So I'm interested to see that piece. I'd also say that, and I've had some conversations with some folks who are working with the Opportunity Alliance and Police Department in trying to structure some sort of juvenile liaison position that could help to deal with some of these misdemeanors that the police department officers have even said they often, their way of deterring the school to prison pipeline is to really just not engage with the kids, right? To give them a warning and to kind of leave it alone. Versus in the schools, when we see one of these misdemeanors take place, we're not just going to leave it alone. We're going to help the child and try to figure out through our support systems, try to figure out how to, how to dig through the layers of why that conduct and that behavior is happening. So I would assume that the police department would be really happy with this policy and the clarity that we're aiming to provide with it. So I just wanted to say that. And again, to say that I think I'm very, very happy with where we are. Again, having said that at the beginning, I want to ensure that KLG was going to be necessary. Now I think it's all we need. Great. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, it'll be good to engage them. I'll say just, briefly, out of the incident at King last week, we really, had, out of a very difficult situation, a really, I think, kind of positive experience in terms of like that collaboration. I know we were using that word in that introduction, but in terms of that, and we have a pending kind of debrief of that, just to be able to capture some lessons learned in terms of safety and crisis management. So just a nod to, where it's now surfaced, a really continuing strong kind of positive relationship there in terms of how those issues got managed. Javier, do you want to speak briefly, or do you want me to summarize?
Yeah, I don't have the details close enough to do the briefing on it, so I'd appreciate it if you could do it.
Right. And I think, what I'll say is, just as a bit of an update in the thinking, right, as we've kind of been coming in, that part of what we'd like to bring back, not, for informational purposes, I guess, is in terms of kind of the allocation of those resources. So the directive, in the resolution that the board adopted, almost a year ago was, to, use those to further fund the district's unfunded equity priorities. So through some discussion, both with the Deering High community, they've done some engagement over the course of this spring with their PBIS team, some level of student engagement. And similarly, on the Portland High side, they've done some engagement with their leadership team, some of their social work team to get input around kind of what the needs are. And so in alignment with our priorities moving forward, and the discipline policies, we are looking, there's, significant interest in growing our capacity around restorative practices and having some, technical assistance and support around that work, recognizing that there's a desire, there's a research base that supports that in terms of interrupting kind of the disparities in discipline outcomes and kind of consistent with what we've articulated in our discipline policies. So we're working on developing a kind of a scope of what that would look like to essentially kind of have an RF, it won't be as formal as an RFP, but to be able to kind of engage and consider some potential providers to be able to provide some support and training, in this coming year around that work, both, with some work targeted to, specifically at Deering and Portland, right? But also supporting our district-wide efforts around this, where, asserting kind of restorative practices and de-escalation is one of our kind of core strategies in terms of safe and equitable schools for the coming year. So it would, kind of be in service of supporting that work as well. So, so broadly, just wanted to kind of update on what some level, and I'll admit it, with everything, there have been, appreciate, Dr. Ahmed, leading that work at Deering in terms of getting some of that feedback, and, Principal Jepson at Portland High of holding some space for some of this engagement. And want to recognize, it's been a little episodic in terms of like trying to figure out where we're at and managing all the other aspects of how school is organized and run as we've been coming out of the various iterations of school that have played out this spring in planning for the fall. But we are feeling, like it's kind of coming together in terms of this alignment. So that's our charge this summer, to be able to kind of line that up and, identify what that is and what that cost would be. So then depending on what the remaining, if there are remaining resources, which, potentially there will be, how we then might choose, allocate those remaining resources. So anything you want to add? So I think that was just kind of the informational update of, we're continuing to work on this and think about it in alignment with kind of our overall strategic direction. I wanted folks to be aware of what that looks like and our next steps in that work.
I just had a quick question to clarify, Aaron, if okay. Yeah. So it sounds like the thinking would be, am I right that the thinking was about like community providers doing the training of staff versus hired staff positions doing restorative work? Is that right? That's kind of where the conversation is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Certainly at this juncture, I mean, this is an ongoing, I think, my experience and, I know Dr. Ahmed and I, that, building a foundation and a culture around adopting restorative practices needs to begin at kind of, using our language around, kind of the tier 1 and PBIS needs to be around building culture at kind of just the school level. A lot of times people will assume kind of the entry point of kind of the relationship with like a Maine youth court and some of those institutions, which are great and do valuable work. But trying to initiate RJ work at the level of like, significant discipline stuff where there's not a culture that supports that, generally is unsuccessful. That's been my experience, what I've seen in other. And so I think, in connection with our priority of creating a sense of belonging and connection. So maybe over time that changes, but in terms of for this year's efforts, right? Because these are existing resources within our local budget. But for this year's efforts in terms of the allocation of that feels like our priority, or that's what's emerged as a priority from the discussions in both schools and district.
Okay. Thank you. And that would be with the hopes for in the coming school year for this to be, okay, great. Thank you.
Can I assume that we'll get more updates before the start of the school year based on, all right, thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep. So I appreciate the update, and we'll once you have more details after your vacation, I'm sure you'll update us. Do we have anything else on for today? Excellent. So unless we have any other board member comments or questions, we can take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So moved by Aura, second by Jeff, I might just need you a second.
I'm getting there. Second. Sorry.
And that's all right. And all those in favor, we can indicate. And Jeff, if you can give us a verbal yay.
My hand's raised. Yay.
Good. So that's unanimous with Emily voting with us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is our last meeting before our July break. So I hope everyone has a restful month off. And we'll be in touch. And we'll see you guys in August.